Hi and welcome back to Bike Speeds. This week we're going to service this Peugeot Pulse. This is early 90s this bike, but with this one we're going the whole hog. We've got new headset bearings, new bottom bracket bearings, all the new cables. We're rebuilding the hub, the free hub itself. We're rebuilding the wheel bearings, all the cables, everything on this bike. We're even truing the wheel, changing the tyres, changing the chain. Everything will be as new on this bike. Mechanically this bike will be sound, and as you can see here from these before shots, very rusty in places, got an awful lot of cobwebs, and it is just very much a bike that has stood in a shed and clearly has issues with standing around. This bike was probably in good condition when it was stood up, but it has gone rusty through dampness, and it's got, like I say, a lot of spiders webs on it, so it would suggest that I think this has been in and out building somewhere, and we're going to resurrect it, recommission it, get it absolutely spot on. So initially I'm going to do as we do with all our bikes when we're servicing them of this nature. We'll strip the bike right down, we'll get all these old components off that we know we're going to be cleaning or replacing. So in this instance you can see this cassette is fully rusted out. It would almost be pointless really re-putting this on the bike. We're going to be putting new chain on there anyway, and the fact that it had that rust that was so inground, I don't think we'd have cleaned it up nicely enough to warrant keeping it, so we're going to replace that. You can see here I couldn't even get the chain off this bike, and you can see there's a spider's nest in there with some eggs in it, so we're going to clean up all those, get this back fresh, re-lubricated so that these parts are ready to continue their journey and continue doing a few more miles. Again, here you can see there's dampness rust on this, a little bit of rust on the back, a little bit of rust on the inner plates. Most of that cleaned off just by cleaning it, and almost just by wetting it, it was enough to get that off. We had an issue with this bottom bracket. You can see here this chain set is grimy on the back, but it was very stiff to turn on this bike when we first got the bike in. You can see there that pedal arm at 90 degrees, it's not moving at all in its bearing freely. So we're going to address that by replacing this bottom bracket. So we're going to remove the old one, and you can see there the water that dribbled out of that. So this frame at some point has got wet. That water was probably sat in there for years. Probably last time this bike was ever ridden was used in the rain. That water's probably sat in there ever since, and it just absolutely rusted those bearings away to the point where they were seized on the bike. So I'm going to swap those ones out as well. Get these brake calipers off. You notice there I've already took the brake pads off. You can see me undoing the front ones there. It's a little bit easier to undo those on the bike than off the bike. I'm going to replace those because the rubber had gone hard, so we'll swap those out as well. So I took those off before I actually took the calipers off of the bike. Just makes my job easier. You can see there the cobwebs and the grind. You can see on that spring how there's corrosion on there. That's clearly from dampness where it's very flaky, so we'll clean all that off as well. I removed this bottle cage. We actually didn't put that back on. We left that off when we actually rebuilt the bike. It was just presented the bike a little bit nicer, and so that's what we were doing there. Again, I'm taking all these fittings off. I really want to clean this bike right up. The fact it's sat so damp, I want to make sure all those components are free and working correctly. So out come all the cables. You can see here the bar tape, how that's gone a green colour. There's a lot of sort of mossy greenness on that. So we're going to replace the handlebar tape as well. We'll clean all those handlebars up. We'll get all these cables out, even get the hoods off, clean those up and lubricate them, make sure everything is spot on when this bike is rebuilt. So that's what we're now doing. All the cables coming out, get those shifters off, get this old tape off, get these old cables out of the bike. Really make sure that we're right back to the frame with this one before we clean it. And getting that mold off the bike was essential from a safety point of view. The bike was unrideable for that reason alone. And you can see here, this is one of the old cables. They are actually galvanized still, so you can see there how they've gone rusty. We're actually going to use what we call our super slick cables, which are stainless steel. They won't rust in the same manner as that. And those rusty cables that were on this bike were really what's holding this bike up from doing any gear shifting. You would not have been able to ride this bike. Even if you swap that chain out, the rest of the bike was in need of sorting out because there was so much corrosion involved with the bike. So with this chain set here, I'm going to take this apart. It's a good practice with this. I can re-lubricate all the bolts, clean up all these rings in the ultrasonic cleaner. So these components are going in now. So the derailleurs, the brakes, everything like that through the ultrasonic cleaner. That'll get all this debris that was on them off, all those cobwebs and everything else will come off of there. Wash them down. I mean, you can see there, even that rust is cleaned off just in the ultrasonic cleaner. So we'll wash all these parts down, wash all that degreaser off of them to make sure it's not lingering on the parts. So we're using a warm soapy water there to wash them off. from our degreaser that's in the ultrasonic cleaner. Get all these parts really cleaned up. We're using our detailing brush there. That was what this bike was all about, was detailing, so we didn't even use the big softy brush that you see in our other videos on the frame, but you'll see that as we're moving forwards. So we wash off these parts, re-lubricate them, which is what we're now going to do. So we're using premium grease here on the jockey wheels themselves. I'll make sure that they're nicely lubricated and everything spins nicely in those. You can see we've cleaned all the debris off the wheels themselves. We're using a little bit of Loctite on the frame of this derailleur to make sure these pivot bolts in the jockey wheels themselves don't come undone once the bike's being used. So we'll just tighten those up, get everything nice there. And then with this one, we're using our copper grease on the threads, general purpose grease on the thumb adjuster there. That will just stop that sticking to the adjuster itself. And then we wind that into the derailleur, and then we're going to also lubricate the derailleur itself. So the spring there, I'm using our premium grease. I'm using our all-purpose oil on the pivot points. Just helps them along. Same with this front derailleur, same principles. All-purpose oil on the pivot points, same on the brake as well. And you see there, I even use our silicone grease. We actually use this twice in this video. Don't always see that in our videos, but a little bit of silicone grease on the slider of the brake spring. And again, we'll lubricate all the components on that brake. I'm going to go the new brake pads. So these are brand new, so the rubber's a little bit softer, hasn't hardened up, give a nice actuation to the brake. And then we're just going to also lubricate the skewers for the wheels. So general purpose grease on the shaft there, a little bit of copper grease on the threads, a little bit of general purpose oil on the arm of the lever itself. And that's the way we work with all these components. A very similar principle depending on which part it is, and they're all done in a similar way. Again, general purpose grease there on the spider of the arm there, just to stop those components bonding together in any way with corrosion down the line once the bike's rebuilt. Torque those up with a torque wrench to make sure they're absolutely spot on. A little bit easier on the bench than on the bike. And now we're going to work this epic job on this rear wheel. It took us almost as long to film this wheel as it did the rest of the bike. Initially we get this axle out, so I'm going to replace the wheel bearings in there. So out comes the axle, out comes the wheel bearings themselves. Pop those caps off so that I can really get to the cups to clean those up, get all that old grease out. Now with this hub, I'm just going to slacken off the bolt that holds the hub together, then slacken off the bolt that holds the hub to the wheel. So now that comes off, and now that I've slackened that off, I can undo this by hand just to get this retaining lock ring out of the hub in order to take it apart. And you see the bearings there fell out because there's no lubricant left in that hub. The hub was very grimy and you could feel it when you were pedaling backwards, most noticeably, or rather when I spun the wheel backwards and held that, I could notice that that was definitely needing a service. So this has all gone through the ultrasonic cleaner now. Again, same principle as with the derailleurs. Wash the components off that within that wheel, clean up the hubs themselves. I'm just using a spray degreaser there and a nice brass bristle brush and a little bit of wire wool just to clean out the cups themselves. Spray that all down, and then before I put the hub back together, I'm going to wash the wheel down, check all the spokes. And this is what I often mention in other videos about checking the spokes when I wash the wheel down, because what I did discover with this wheel, there were 2 or 3 spokes that were extremely loose on that wheel, so I knew that it needed retensioning before I put it back together. Now these hubs, I love doing these. So we've got copper grease on the threads, then I use a little bit of silicone on the rubber that seals this to the wheel itself. So a little bit of silicone grease on there, which will help it spin onto the wheel initially. Then a little bit of grease on the pawls themselves, a little bit of Shimano grease there, which is specific for hubs. And then I'm going to use our premium grease for the ball bearings there on the races. So a little bit of our premium grease. I'm going to the new ball bearings. Like I say, I get an awful lot of satisfaction out of doing these because we're using all our various greases. You can buy these grease syringes on our website, so check out the link in the description below. As with a lot of the things that we use in our videos, like the cables and the brushes that we use for detailing and the greases that we use on the various components, you can get all those on our website, so do check out the link in the description below. On goes that hub now. So I'll torque that up to make sure that's torqued to the correct setting. Fresh premium grease into the bearing cups themselves. In go these brand new bearings. So we now know we've got all new hub bearings, all new, nicely re-greased. The axle itself now has got all the new bearings and the fresh grease. So this will spin beautifully once it goes back on the bike. It is as new in terms of bearing work and the way it feels on the road and everything else about the build on that. This is a different wheel to what come off of this bike. So we get those final cups adjusted up and make sure they're correct on the bench, and now I could do the truing work on this wheel. You can see here on this graph on the left how there were so many tensions on the wheel that were incorrect, so I worked my way around that wheel. You can see here this is more of a graphic representation of how the wheel was when it came in and then how it went out. It got quite accurate really for such an old wheel of this nature. I got this within a very few percent, and as you can see there, it's a vast difference to the way this wheel is rolling and the way it would even feel when you're handling the bike. I also managed to true out that wobbling left and right, which I'm really pleased with. Next up, a little bit of general purpose grease on the hub itself before I put on a new cassette. So we've got the brand new cassette on there, which you can see the difference in that to the original one. It just made no sense to put the old one back on. And then finally with this wheel, the final piece of this jigsaw puzzle to the wheel rebuild itself is to put on a new tyre and tube. So we did this on the front as well. New tyre and tube, just makes sense. The rubber and everything on this bike had deteriorated. The rubber on the tyres themselves had deteriorated. Although it didn't have punctures, there was still a little bit of air left in the tyres. Made no sense at all to put the original inner tubes back in this bike. So we've got new inner tubes, new tyres, inflate those correctly, nicely trued, all new bearings, hub all sorted out, brand new cassette, and that's ready to go back on the bike. Now moving on to the headset bearings, you can see here how rusty the one on the left is there. That was completely corroded up. The one on the right, the greases had completely dried out. You would never have been able to ride this bike in a straight line. It would have trammed down the road, it would have held the bearings in their one spot, and it would have been a nightmare to have ridden this bike as it was. So with a rebuild like this, it makes sense to redo your headset bearings. I'm not going to use the bearings in a cage as they were originally, because as you can see when I clean this up, you'll notice there's some little marks in this once I dry this off, and that's because the bearings have created little grooves into this race itself. So what I'm going to do is put loose balls all the way around, which means there's more support to the bearings that are there, and you're less likely to get them dropping into those little grooves and holding the steering. With the fresh grease and everything else, that will work well. We had another issue with this headset, very tight when it came in. So I'm going to show you the reason for that, and that's probably why we got those grooves in that top race as well, because the headset bearing itself was so tight initially. For now, we're just putting these new bearings in here with our premium grease, a little bit on the top as well, because that will hold it against the gravity as I put it back into the frame. It just holds those bearings where I need them as I put this initial lock ring on. Now this was the problem we had with this bearing. You can see here we've got a groove on this lock ring. That is actually for a washer that was missing completely from this headset. So there should be a washer sitting in there which should look like this with a little peg. That sits in a groove in the back of the forks, and the idea is you adjust the bottom one that's already in there to get the bearing feel correct. Then you put the washer on, then you put this lock ring on. You should be able to lock this off without the bottom ring turning at all. And that's what we ended up with, it being refitted correctly where it was incorrect when it came in and had actually been locked off, which had tightened those bearings up to where the steering was so stiff. So we've even got that nice now and correct as it should be. So clean the handlebars up there, the residue from the handlebar tape, and now we're going to wash down this frame. So we've used a little soapy wash on there, and then we're using one of our detailing brushes. We do these in a pack of 5 on our website, so do check that out as well. The link is in the description below. So we're just going to wash this frame off. Rather than using a big soft, it's nice to do it a little bit more tactilely with a bike of this nature. And I'm just going to wash out the rusty water that was in the threads of that bottom bracket, clean those up with a brass bristled brush again, just to make sure the threads are nice for when we rethread in the bottom bracket, and that we won't have that residue that was in there left in there before we put the bottom bracket on. Next up, we're going to polish the frame. You can see here we're using our Auto Glim Super Resin Polish. Again, this is available on our website. But we're going to polish down the frame. We're going to spend a little bit of time as we go around the frame, bringing it up really nicely. There was a lot of green and debris on this frame, which you'll see in the before and afters, but this really worked its magic on, got that off, and we were able to really polish this frame up. I mean, you can already see the reflection on those forks. Look at that Peugeot logo, the way the light is starting to reflect really brings it up. But we're also going to ceramic spray this frame as well. It will really protect it against the elements when we're riding the bike. Any water that sits on this bike will literally just almost fall off. It will run away very quickly, which means you don't get that build-up of dirt and debris, and it does give a lovely extra shine to these frames when you polish them. I mean, look at that Peugeot on that down tube. What a lovely reflection. And the Peugeot logo there on the headstock. Look how lovely that reflection is on there. Amazing what you can do with these old bikes with a little bit of care and attention and a nice polish up. So in goes that new bottom bracket. I'm torquing that up. Make sure that the torque setting is correct for that. So in goes the second cup as well. And I'll just torque that up as well. So last little click on the torque wrench there. And now we can really start to put this bike back together. So we'll put the chain set on. Again, I like to torque these up as I put these on because they're obviously pulled together. So I want them to be in the correct position for when I adjust the front derailleur when I put that onto the bike. So I'm popping the front derailleur on now. And again, I will actually torque that up because I find it centralizes it correctly to the front derailleur, where some of these other parts I won't. Now, there were some fittings on the down tube. They had a little bit of a rusty head, so I swapped those out with a nice fresh one. Just one of those details on here that would make the world of difference to the bike in terms of the way it's presented once the job is finished. So I'll remove that rusty bolt and pop new ones in there. And those fittings that are on that down tube before we put the cables in are absolutely spot on. Again, there's an adjuster here for the front derailleur. So I'm using our copper grease on the threads to stop those seizing, general purpose grease on the adjuster itself, and that will just help stop that seizing in the frame. Very, very common for those to seize. Same principle on this back brake, copper grease on the fitting that goes into the frame to stop it corroding to the frame to allow us to do any future servicing work on the bike without issue. Next up, we're popping on the hoods, the shifters themselves, and I'm going to torque those up. This is often a torque wrench setting that is wildly missed regularly. Whenever I do a service, invariably I have to re-torque up the hoods of a bike on any nature of bike, be that an old bike like this or a brand new bike. That's always one that's missed. So we just did that as well. And I'm taping these cables into their position on the handlebars. We're using our super slick stainless steel cables here, and they are a lovely tightly wound stainless steel cable, very smooth through your fingers when you drag them through your fingers. Different world to what was on this bike in terms of shifting and longevity of those cables. They are a great cable, so do check those out as well on our website. We do sell packs of those cables. Now we cut off the ends of the front and rear brakes. The shiny cables make a huge difference to the look of the bike. It's really an underrated way to shine the bike up. So that's the brake cables all sorted. Now we're onto the gear cables. These are going straight into the thumb adjusters on the frame. Again, those didn't even turn when the bike came in. So that's another major flaw we've solved with re-lubricating them. All the brakes and derailleurs have also been lubricated, so that when we put this back together, everything is going to be working as new, if not better. So tail on the end of that one, that's the front derailleur. Torque that up, on goes the rear. And you would have noticed with the brakes we use a little guide on the cables, which we also use there on the rear derailleur, so that we get those tails the same length, and that way we can recognize our own cabling work moving down the line, that they're all very, very similar in that nature. In go the bolts for the accessories. Again, I've replaced those, they're brand new ones, just to make that a little bit extra detail, a little bit nicer. And then I'm going to re-tape the handlebars themselves with fresh bar tape, just to make that smooth. You saw how green and grimy the old ones were, and obviously with recabling there was no point in reusing that. So we're just getting fresh bar tape on here, tape up the ends as we're doing there, and that's now looking really, really nice on the hoods and on the handlebars themselves. Putting the end bungs into the handlebars, and we can get the wheels on now. So on goes that front wheel, on goes the rear wheel, and now we can put the heartbeat of the bike back on. We're using one of our lovely silver chains here. Beautiful chains these, really look the business on a restoration like this. A little bit of adjustment on the rear derailleur there. The front was actually okay, and we've got the gears changing nicely, popping up and down on those front rings as well, exactly as it should be. We just check out the brakes, align those with the calipers, make sure everything there is working as well. We're quite happy now with that. So now what I'll do is move through the bike with my torque wrench, just to make sure that everything is at the correct torque, where it needs to be for the bike, and that I'm absolutely happy with everything we've done front to back as we work through the bike with the torque wrench. So you can see there, brakes are all torqued up, the pads, the pinch bolts. I realigned this clamp here for the seat post, it was just a little bit misaligned, so I realigned that, torqued that up as well, torque up the saddle. That's the original Peugeot saddle on there, and you can see here from these before and afters what a huge difference we've made to this bike. This was a non-runner. You could not have rid another meter on this bike. It was life extinct from that point of view. We've made it much safer with the front headset bearings. We've done all the wheel bearings, all the bottom bracket bearings, new chains, new cables, new brake pads, tyres, tubes. This bike now is ready to do thousands of miles. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please do subscribe to the channel. Do check us out in the future. Drop a comment in the comments below, and we'll see you again very soon. Bye for now.